Updating EMU MMC firmware has traditionally been done with Daybreak, and it's been a reliable solution for years. Today, I'm comparing that familiar workflow with the new firmware update feature built into HATS Tools. Both methods achieve the same result, but they take a different approach. Let's see how they compare, step by step. In this chapter, I'll walk you through the traditional Daybreak firmware update workflow. Since Daybreak is an offline updater, you'll need to download a firmware package first. Before we continue, we'll need a reliable firmware source. There are several options available online, but for this demonstration, I'll be using the NXFW firmware pack from my GitHub repository. The same firmware pack will also be used later with HATS Tools, ensuring that both workflows are compared using the exact same firmware package. Go ahead and open the releases page. Locate the firmware version you want to install, then download the corresponding firmware zip package. At the time of recording, the latest available release is 22.5.0. Once the download has finished, create a folder named FW on your computer. Open the firmware zip with your preferred archive manager. Then extract all of its contents into the FW folder. After the extraction is complete, open your Switch SD card and copy the entire FW folder to the root of the SD card. Once the copy is finished, safely eject the SD card and insert it back into your Switch before continuing with the update. Back in the Homebrew menu, launch Daybreak to begin the firmware update. Select Install, then choose the FW folder containing the extracted firmware files. Daybreak will validate the firmware package before proceeding. Once the validation is complete, press Continue. You'll then be presented with several installation options, including whether to preserve settings or reset to factory settings, as well as whether to install the FAT32 driver only or FAT32 plus exFAT support. Review the options, make your selections, and press Continue to start the installation. When the installation is complete, you'll be given the choice to reboot or shut down. Select Reboot to restart the console and finish the firmware update. In this chapter, we'll go through the HATS Tools firmware update workflow using the GitHub or online method. HATS Tools supports both online and offline firmware updates. We'll start with the online workflow, then cover the offline method in the next chapter. Launch HATS Tools and select Update Firmware. You'll be presented with two update methods, GitHub for online updates or local for offline updates. In this chapter, we'll be using the GitHub method. A list of available firmware versions will be displayed. Simply select the version you want to install. In this demonstration, I'll be installing 22.5.0, which is currently the latest available release. Before downloading, HATS Tools performs a HATS compatibility check to verify whether the selected firmware is compatible with your current HATS pack release. This helps prevent installing a firmware version that may not yet be fully supported. If an incompatibility is detected, you'll be notified before continuing. Once the compatibility check passes, HATS Tools will automatically download the firmware package from GitHub. After the download completes, the firmware package is automatically validated, with no manual extraction or SD card preparation required. Next, choose the target environment for the update. In this example, we'll install the firmware to EMU MMC with FAT32 plus exFAT support enabled. Select Install to begin the firmware update. Once the installation is complete, choose Reboot to restart the console and finish the update. In this chapter, we'll go through the offline firmware update workflow using HATS Tools. Just like Daybreak, the offline method uses a locally stored firmware package. Launch HATS Tools, select Update Firmware, then choose Local or Offline. Next, select the FW folder that we prepared earlier. This is the exact same firmware package we used in the Daybreak workflow. HATS Tools will validate the firmware package, then perform a HATS compatibility check to verify that the selected firmware is compatible with your current HATS pack release before continuing. Once everything has been successfully validated, you'll be prompted to install firmware 22.5.0 to EMU MMC with FAT32 plus exFAT support. Select Install to begin the firmware update. When the installation is complete, choose Reboot to restart the console and finish the update. As you've seen, all three workflows ultimately achieve the same goal, updating your firmware successfully. The difference isn't the final result, it's the workflow. Daybreak follows a traditional offline process, while HATS Tools gives you the flexibility to update either online through GitHub or offline using the same firmware package. Neither approach is mandatory. Choose the workflow that best fits your own preference. That said, going forward, Daybreak will no longer be included with future HATS pack releases. HATS Tools will become the default firmware updater while still supporting both online and offline update methods in a single application. If you still prefer using Daybreak, you're free to download and use it separately. It's simply no longer bundled with HATS Pack. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.